Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's staying safe and, more importantly, sane amidst this lockdown. Uh, so today, as Mark mentioned, we're going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 lockdown on system power demand in New Zealand and also a few other countries around the world. Just sort of give you a brief overview of what you can expect to get out of the presentation today. We're going to talk about the changes in demand levels in New Zealand and then compare a couple of regions within New Zealand. And then we'll talk about the changes in behavior vis-a-vis power consumption, and then compare that to what's happening in other countries and conclude with how we're using all that information to forecast in this time of high uncertainty. I pass it over to Josh.
Thank you, Jai. So first, I thought we'd have a look at the overall demand in New Zealand and what we've seen as we've gone through the different levels. So we see from the graph in the gray what load looked like at this time last year. And then in the blue, what we're seeing during this lockdown period. And we see that in the orange area as we went into level 3 at the end of March, how the load dropped off. And then during that red period, how load has stayed low. And now as we're getting into level 3, we're starting to see this recovery. So even though residential demand has increased as people stay at home, we're seeing this drop off due to the closures in business. So it's nice looking at this just in its raw form, but to get a proper idea of what's going on, we need to look at weather adjusted load. So when we take the weather effects out, we start to see that there's a 15% drop in demand pre-COVID to this COVID period. And that is excluding the holiday period, as you can see with the gray line there. As it gets towards the end of level 4, it's quite jaggedy. That's the April period. So excluding that, we see this around a 15% drop. So what is the difference across the regions? Well, if we take a densely populated area like Auckland, we start to see that there's a larger decrease in demand. So Auckland has seen up to and beyond a 20% decrease in load compared to pre-COVID times. Whereas a place like Hamilton, which is more sparsely populated, sees less of a decrease. And this is most probably due to more businesses in high populated regions closing down and therefore are not using as much energy. So what is the current situation now in level 3? Well, from this graph, you can see in the dark blue what level 3 looks like. And as expected, it is higher than level 4 in the light blue. And it's starting to approach the pre-COVID level that you can see in the dashed line just above. During the week, last week, that first week of level 3, you can see from the green bars that the load has slowly been recovering since we moved into the level 3 period, whereas the weekends are still remaining relatively low. So with that, I'll pass you back to Jai, who's going to talk a little bit more about the behavioral differences we're seeing.
Yes, at Tesla, we forecast not just the total demand for any given day, but we forecast period to period what the demand profile looks like for the system demand in all of our clients. So for it, it's very important to know how the demand profile has changed and how people's behaviors have changed under the lockdown. And to study that, you see in this graph, what we've plotted is the pre-COVID-19 average weekday demand. So that's from April 2019, and that is weather corrected. And then we've also plotted the level 4 average weekday demand. And we've done a similar thing for Sunday, Saturday, and we've excluded all the holidays so we could sort of take out the noise here. And you'll notice a few things. The first is that the morning peak is delayed. So the whole morning ramp up actually is delayed. And then the peak is not as sharp. It sort of sticks around and stays at that level for a lot longer. And that is primarily because the demand has shifted from industrials and SMEs to residential. And kids are not going to school. People are waking up later than they would otherwise, which is, to be honest, very comforting to see in the data that I'm not the only one rolling out of bed at 8:29 for an 8:30 meeting. So yeah, it seems like that's the trend across the country. The other interesting thing is the evening peaks, which are half an hour or so earlier. So the whole evening behavior has shifted by half an hour. And that's because people are not commuting, you're already home. You flick on the lights as soon as it gets dark. The dinners are earlier. So Steve, it's not just you with your kid. All the rest of us seem to be having earlier dinners as well. So that's the change in the evening. The other interesting thing we noticed is that the COVID demand on a weekday looks very similar to what April looked like in 2019 on Sundays. So as you can see on this graph, the demand profile for a weekday in level 4, it matches more closely with what you would see on a Sunday rather than on a typical weekday. Now moving on to talking about Saturday. Saturday is somewhat of a similar story where the morning peaks are lower and they happen a lot later. And so a pre-COVID Saturday is a lot higher than what we see right now. And that's mainly because businesses, retails, industry, everything that's otherwise be open on Saturday is now closed. But the very interesting thing is that the evening peaks are higher. And I'll touch upon that on the next slide, where we've noticed that before COVID lockdowns, Saturdays and Sundays looked very different. So the Saturdays started out a lot higher and the evenings they were a lot lower, more people were outdoors. The Sundays started out lower but peaked in the evening. However, under lockdown, the behaviors on a Saturday and Sunday are very, very similar. So you see sort of a similar morning ramp up and peaking at the same time and pretty much the same level. So that's sort of an interesting thing to observe. And so it's all days, weekdays and Saturday and Sunday pretty much behave like a Sunday under the lockdown. Now I'll quickly talk about what we've noticed in other parts of the world. Australia is interesting in that the contraction in year-on-year weather-corrected demand is about 5%, which is a lot lower than what we've observed in New Zealand, and that's mainly because the lockdown there is not as strict. They always were in stage 3 of the lockdown, unlike level 4 complete lockdown here. Singapore is similar, about 7% weather-corrected contraction, and that has sort of kicked on once the circuit breaker kicked in, which is Singapore's version of state of emergency, lockdown, alert level, etc. And Japan, there's been a 4% contraction. So sort of sum it up, all these countries around the world and others that we talk to, our colleagues in the US and the UK, have different varying impacts due to lockdown. And New Zealand certainly has one of the highest drops in demand, in percentage demand under the lockdown. Now I'll pass it over to Josh to tell us more about how we've used that information to improve our forecasts.
Thanks, Joe. So it's good having this analysis, but how is this helpful when it comes to forecasting energy? So we've used a few things to try and get a forecast that is accurate. First, we use that similarity between the weekdays and what a normal Sunday would look like to simulate that in the forecasting models. We then looked at what the difference was between level 3 and level 4. Going from those two, between those two stages to see what percentage differences there were. And then from there, we used that in unison with a variable to start to pick up those shape differences. And that got better over time. So we use that to forecast going to level 3 currently, and we'll use the same process when we go into level 2. So the forecast, what did it look like? Well, in this slide here, you'll be able to see the red line, which is the load actuals, what actually happened, and our forecast from 9 a.m. the day before. So you can see we're like fairly good at capturing both the level and the shape. And we're able to achieve a good accuracy of under a 3% for the whole period. And that was even on the first day of level 3. So we're looking again to achieve the same kind of thing when we go into level 2. So with that, that is a brief overview of what effects COVID-19 has had on New Zealand power demand.